For a film that clocks in at approximately 63 minutes long, I thought my review of The Ring of Terror, the 1962 teen college movie with 5 minutes of horror stapled to the beginning and end, would be at least somewhat merciful, considering that it falls well short of the usual 80 to 90 minute feature runtime, and that they don't have a whole lot of time to screw it up. I was wrong. Hell, I was thinking when I first chose this film to talk about that I'd probably end up just declaring it a grey zone movie that had some good points and bad points before getting on with my life. And yet, 2018 is only really just getting underway, and I honestly think that I won't see a film as awful as this one anytime soon. Ring of Terror was directed by Clark Paylows, his only stab at feature directing, and one of only 2 directing credits he ever achieved, the other being for an episode of the TV show Sky King. Yeah, me neither. While he didn't do a whole lot of directing, he was quite prolific as an assistant director, with credits for several stinkers including The Time Travelers, Vengeance in the Saddle, and a whole string of forgettable bikini beach movies. Basically, if it involved Poundland saddles or beach shenanigans, Paylows was probably involved somewhere down the line. As for the writers... This was written by Louis Simeon and Gerald Zinnemann, and this was the only thing the pair ever worked on, both together and solo. It's not unusual really for this channel to find a director with little to no experience in his position working with writers with no experience whatsoever in writing mainstream features, but I always like to think that even with the lack of experience present, that there's always the very slight possibility that they might pull off the almost impossible and produce something absolutely astounding, either in terms of actually being good or being infamous. After all, The Room was one man's vision who had had no previous directing experience, and that went on to become one of the most infamously good bad movies of the modern age. So for better or worse, I got an hour free and decided to check this film out. And it's garbage. Here's why. Ring of Terror opens with what can best be described as a cross between the intro to Plan 9 from Outer Space meets the narrator from the Rocky Horror Picture Show, who, to be blunt, talks a load of crap about mortality before suddenly, and quite randomly, running out of his house into a graveyard to rescue his cat. He then spots a grave, and the film begins properly with a flashback to 1955. The rest of the film then follows Lewis Moffitt, played by George Mather, an actor in his 30s playing a student in his 20s training to become a doctor. Lewis likes to show off and pretend to be the strong man who isn't afraid of anything, even going as far as to offer his services to his professor as a mortician's assistant during an autopsy. A job this film would make you think was up there with Poison Taster. Lewis is going steady with Betty, a girl also attending Lewis's college. Now, the film from here on in is basically just set pieces. The script has all the subtlety of a sledgehammer to the nads and is only twice as painful, so here's what happens next, to the best of my ability. Lewis and Betty go on a date, a snake manages to get into Lewis's car, Lewis literally kills the snake on screen, Peter would have a field day with that one, and after the ordeal, the pair go to the school's cafeteria. Whilst in the cafeteria, a lot of fat jokes are made, and there's some patter about an upcoming autopsy the doctors are going to. There's also mention of the medical students joining a fraternity. Then there's the autopsy scene, which runs for approximately 5 million years and adds nothing at all to the plot, apart from one key element that they could have illustrated in about 2 minutes. Then there's a scene with some backstory about Lewis's past and how he's scared of the dark, and of corpses. Sort of. But not really. Then there's a barbecue and all the med students are given their fraternity challenges. The fat student has to lose weight. One of the students has to go and sexually harass a load of women, etc, etc. Then there's a beauty contest that runs for another 5 million years and comes out of absolute nowhere with no setup and pretty much no payoff. Then Lewis gets his pledge, which is that he has to break into the morgue and steal the ring off a cadaver he was assisting the autopsy on. He does this, and a cat, the dark, and the cadaver scare him to the point that he has a massive heart attack, and then the narrator comes back on for 5 more minutes, tells us that Lewis died, and has a god-awful monologue about mortality again. And then the film just ends. That's it. That's the whole movie. And I feel bad that I just explained the whole plot to you, but to be honest, if I didn't, it would be even harder to convey to you just how ludicrous this 63-minute film actually is. If I had to theorise exactly why it is the way it is, I'd suggest that it was originally written as a teen comedy movie. But just before production started, there was a shift in the market towards the rising popularity of B-movie horror films, so they decided to rework it, by literally writing a prologue at the beginning and tweaking the ending, thus turning it into a horror film on the cheap. It's the only way I can figure out why this film is the way it is, because anything less than that, and I seriously have to start casting doubts on whoever agreed to fund this picture. Where do I even begin in attempting to critique this? In writing this review, I spent at least half an hour writing an opening paragraph and then deleting it, because in my mind all of these elements are jostling for the worst element of this film. And I can't honestly tell you which one element of this production is the worst. The direction is almost non-existent, cast members are just loitering in scenes with cameras on. They aren't animated, they don't look comfortable or happy on set, and none of the scenarios they're placed in come with even a vague sense of believability. It's largely just people standing or sitting in large groups with no screen presence, murmuring to each other. It's absolutely terrible. The acting is almost as bad, with lines being constantly muffled because the cast members don't speak loudly or clearly enough. None of the cast have any animation in their voices, they all sound monotonous and seem to be there to collect a paycheck and go home. Even the better performances in this film are only just about passable. And that's me being nice. Not that they had a particularly good script to work with in the first place, with dialogue that no human would ever speak, and scenarios that would just never happen in real life. In particular, 2 characters who are both just a little bit overweight, not even particularly fat, just a little bit pudgy, are mercilessly picked on throughout this film for being fatty fat fatties. To the point where the joke is basically just, hey, these guys eat more food than they should. It gets old pretty quickly. They've also gone out of their way to make the women of this film totally weak and useless, with Betty, played by Esther First, effectively being there to offer support to Lewis, and in no way must she question his ability or authority. And that's about it. All the other women in this film don't have a lot of lines, and what lines they do have are pretty much on a par with, "Oh you," and that's about it. The cinematography isn't much better, with 90% of the shots being static and often not centred shots of the cast just stood or sat down, and no creativity has been put into considering the placement of these camera positions. They're all just mids or close-ups. What wides they do use are usually out of necessity, because the scene has about 12 to 15 people in them, so it feels like none of these positions happened through choice. It also looks really soft throughout. I can't tell if that's because of my copy of the film, or if it's just an error that occurred during the production. The editing, both from a visual and audio perspective, look as if they've been done by somebody who has never cut a film in their lives. From a visual standpoint, the cuts here are blunt to the point of travesty. Shots just end. They don't finish with a natural progression or transition. They cut harsh and they cut heavy. The editor used B-roll that's often not relevant to the scene, just because it existed. And more often than not, it feels as if there wasn't a clear intention on how this film should look. I could have cut this film better blindfolded. I'm not saying that as a way of bigging myself up here. I'm literally saying anyone could have done a better job cutting this film than the person who cut it. It's quite possibly the worst edit I've ever seen, and I went to film school, so I've seen some dreck in my time. The sound edit doesn't get away with it either. Sound just comes crashing into the film with the subtlety of a wrecking ball, and it exits just as brutally. There are little to no fades in this film, and the music just cuts in and out as necessary. Quite frequently, music is looped in such an obvious way you'll hear the same piece of music about 3 or 4 times in 10 seconds. Disastrous is the only word for this. My copy of The Ring of Terror was found on the Nightmare Worlds box set, a 50-disc set released by Mill Creek Entertainment in 2008. If you're a regular viewer of my show, you should know at this point that Mill Creek basically round up public domain movies and films that cost next to nothing for the distribution rights, and then shove them out the door multiple times under the guise of various box sets. There's no clean-up on these films. Hell, 90% of them usually come from a film print literally copied from a VHS tape. This film's no exception, by the way. The print quality's border unwatchable. It's a VHS source, and whether it's just my copy of the film or whether it's a problem from the production, I can't say. But this film is woefully underlit and drenched in print errors, from scratches to tram lines and all the broken bits in between. I don't use unwatchable lightly. There are points in this film where you are effectively watching a black screen with lighter black smudges moving about on it. And that's about it. The film also starts and stops a couple of seconds too late, meaning the intro just begins and the ending finishes too early. It all feels a bit cut off. The biggest insult, and it's been a good while since I've seen anything like this, Mill Creek have burnt a watermark into the bottom corner of this film. And it would be okay if it was at least subtle, but it really isn't. It's noticeable, and quite distracting. Especially if the film's so bad you want to watch the watermark more than the feature. It's bad when realistically you could miss out 30 minutes of a just over 60-minute feature and still know exactly what's going on. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, as an example, that Animal House wasn't funny, was badly written, had awful direction, cinematography, acting, editing and lighting, and opened and closed with the opening and closing 5 minutes of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre randomly stitched on. And you'd be somewhere on the road to where this film is. It feels like it has a runtime that goes on for an eternity, and when the best I can say about a film is that the cast weren't the worst I've ever seen, you know your film's screwed up. Seriously, I think this wasn't intended as a horror film. I'd put good money on it being the case that this was a sleazy cash-in via rewriting an unfunny teen comedy minimally by topping and tailing it with horror elements. It's a bad film even by 50s and 60s standards, and that's saying something. A stunning film to be avoided at all costs, unless you like the idea of long waits and little returns. Dig out the MST3K riff of this one. You'll thank me for it.